You're listening to a business transformation podcast from Consult Llewellyn. Your host, Rob Llewellyn, is an independent program manager who has helped companies across Europe, the Middle East, and Australia achieve their strategic objectives since the 1990s. His pragmatic use of industry best practices, combined with an ability to engage effectively with stakeholders, manage risk and benefits, and encourage a sense of urgency, helps companies join the minority 30% that achieve successful business transformation as planned.
Many managers and leaders at all levels are likely to have never stopped to really think of why and how stakeholders present unique challenges and opportunities, and more importantly, how best to prevent issues becoming problems that could delay projects and programs. Dr. Linda Bourne from Melbourne, Australia, is an international authority on stakeholder engagement using the Stakeholder Circle. She works with organisations to manage change through managing the relationships that are essential for successful delivery of organisational outcomes. She's presented these ideas at conferences and seminars in Europe, Russia, Asia, the United States and Australia to audiences from the IT, construction, defence and mining industries. Linda is the international faculty at a university in Bogota, Colombia, and the author of Stakeholder Relationship Management and Advising Upwards, both published by Gower. I'm pleased to speak to Linda today about stakeholder relationship management. Welcome, Linda.
Hello, Rob. Thank you.
Linda, firstly, can you just set the scene and explain to us why you wrote a book on stakeholder management?
I have been working in projects for 30 odd years now, starting with IT projects and moving on to other things, and obviously moving off project management onto more management consulting arenas. But I found that over that time that it didn't matter how well we followed the processes, it didn't matter how well we did all of the dotted the I's and crossed the T's, things would always go wrong. And when we started to look at the things that went wrong, we found that it was always about the people. Because when you think about it, to run a project or to do almost anything, very few of these activities you do on your own. And so it's people who make decisions, it's people who act, it's people who are the risk, it's people who, if they're working with you, will make you more successful, or if they're not working with you, you'll be wasting a lot of time in dealing with conflict. And at that time, I was looking for some help from existing methodologies on managing stakeholder relationships and didn't find much. So I started to think about ways to improve that. So eventually we got to a place where we were starting to develop more advanced communication strategies and plans. But also around about that time, I decided I wanted to go back and do some more research and reflection on stakeholders and organisations. And from that process of doing my doctorate, I developed a methodology and a more consistent process for understanding who stakeholders are and developing ways to manage the relationships between the stakeholders and the projects or organisation work that we were doing. The book came from that, from the thesis. After teaching for probably 3 or 4 years, I decided that it would be a really good thing to write the book, and hence the book.
Linda, a very basic question. Every manager and leader out there will be talking about stakeholder management, but what is it? What exactly is stakeholder management?
Rob, as I've already said, everything we do, we depend on people, or we work with people, or we're doing the work for the people. And so by understanding the nature of the people that we depend on or work with, we're actually able to think in terms of how we can develop better relationships. So stakeholders are groups or individuals who are affected by the work that's being done, or can affect the success of the work that's being done, or believe they have a stake in that outcome. And so these days, stakeholders has a much wider definition than it did in the earlier days, which means also that there is a need for a more sophisticated approach in understanding who stakeholders are and how best to develop those relationships.
And Linda, why do these stakeholders really matter to organizations, to projects and programs?
Yeah, so this comes back to my amazing discovery years ago that it is the people who will cause my success or cause my failure. And this is really why stakeholders matter. If you only focus on the ones that make the most noise or focus on the ones with the most power and ignore the others, they may be the ones that cause you the most problem. Often it's the lone voice in the wilderness, the one who has a high stake and is willing to persist, that will be the one that will cause you problems in the success of your work. So stakeholders matter because they're crucial to everything we do. And if we ignore the wrong ones, that will be a pathway to losing any successful impetus that we have in our work.
And who can be stakeholders, Linda?
Well, anybody can be stakeholders who are affected by the work or can affect the work or believe themselves to be affected by that. So they can be people like the team, they can be managers, they can be suppliers, government, the public. The environment is often considered to be a stakeholder, or at least people who are representing the best interests of the environment. So it really depends on the work you're doing. And so the starting point for any idea or identification process for stakeholders is to be very clear about what you're doing. And having identified what you're doing, you can then start to think about the groups or individuals that are important to your success.
So, Linda, from what you've just mentioned, it sounds that the breadth of stakeholders can be quite enormous. And typically, as we know, in projects and programs, there are limited resources. So who are the right stakeholders for us to focus our time, the time that we have available? Who are the right stakeholders for us to focus on?
So when starting to plan the work, everybody's happy to spend a lot of time in that planning process. And of course, this is where it's really important to make the most of that enthusiasm. So in the initial planning process, what we need to do is identify all of the people that fit that definition, affected by or can affect. And then starting to think in terms of what the expectations of those stakeholders are. Later on in a process that we'll probably talk about in a moment, having identified who the important stakeholders are, starting to understand the attitude of those important stakeholders, whether they're supportive or not supportive, is a process that will help people who, as they're progressing with their work and have moved away from the original planning phase, they will be able to understand where to focus their scarce resources of time and effort by looking at the important stakeholders who are not supportive. And they will be the ones that will require extra communication or extra effort in one way or another to improve that those important stakeholders will provide the work.
Okay, Linda, so we've identified our stakeholders. Then we need to map our stakeholders. What approach do you recommend for mapping our stakeholders?
So before we come to map them, and it is very important to think about ways to do that, but a step just before that is to, in a consistent way, understand who the important stakeholders really are. Because in the process of identifying stakeholders, as you've already said, sometimes we can identify hundreds of them, and nobody can look after 100 stakeholders in an equal way. Not all stakeholders are equal. And so what we've developed is 3 questions to ask to be able to understand which of our large stakeholder community are the ones we need to focus most of our attention on. And so the 3 questions are, what power does this stakeholder have to stop the project? The second one is, how close is this stakeholder to the work of the project? So in the first instance, someone with a high level of power will be someone like the sponsor or the CEO, who does have a lot of power to either support the work for success or stop it through lack of support or lack of funding. The next step, proximity, is about the people who actually deliver the work with their knowledge or experience, and so they're important stakeholders too. So you can see already we're starting to look at different types of stakeholders. The third question is, what stake has this stakeholder got in the outcomes of the work, and what are they prepared to do about it? So someone with a very high stake who is prepared to do whatever it takes is a formidable stakeholder, particularly if they're working against the success of the project. So having asked those questions and applied some simple rating systems, you're in a position now to develop a list of stakeholders. So the first way of looking at it may just be a ranked list. And in some cases that's enough. But generally speaking, the human mind absorbs information better when it's in graphical style of one way or another. And so there are a number of mapping techniques that people can use. There's the good old 2x2 matrix, which looks at maybe two aspects, power and interest, of the stakeholder community and starts to map them within those four quadrants. For a small, uncomplicated project, that sort of mapping is enough. It will get the message out of who's important, and it will also provide the first level of communication. So communication, saying who my stakeholder community is one of the important first steps. I've developed a more sophisticated tool that looks at a number of different dimensions. So it looks at the type of stakeholder that you can categorise the stakeholders as. So there'll be upwards, senior stakeholders, downwards is the team, sidewards are my peers, who are important for collaboration or competition for scarce resources. Or the final group is a large group of people or individuals or groups like suppliers or the government or the public, etc. So that's one of the most important starting points. And if you can show in a picture what typology they belong to, that's another way to assist people and develop their communication. It also shows another couple of aspects like the power that they have, the influence that they have as well. So in one picture it shows 3 or 4 different aspects. So it's useful in that way.
Linda, all of our stakeholders, they all have their different attitudes towards what we are trying to achieve. Is there a way that we can measure stakeholder attitude?
Well, the way that we use, and we found it's been very successful, is to look at 2 dimensions. One is the level of support that a stakeholder has for the work, and the other one is receptiveness to information about the project or the work itself. And what we've developed is a 5x5 matrix so that the x-axis looks at support, starting number 1 being completely unsupportive or antagonistic, and number 5 is very supportive. And then on the y-axis, receptiveness will be 0, doesn't want to talk about it at all, doesn't want to hear anything about it, to 5, which is going to be a very high level of interest. And so what we're able to do is, by asking those 2 questions, map on that matrix the current level of support and receptiveness, which I've called attitude. And of course, you also need to know where you're aiming. So the second set of questions about support and receptiveness will be, what attitude do we want this stakeholder to have for success of the work? Now, if those 2 points coincide, we don't need to do anything else. We just need to give them the information we've already been giving them because they're supportive of what we do. But if we have important stakeholders who where there is a large gap between their current attitude and their target attitude, we know that we have to do additional work to make sure that we improve the level of support, or in some way we engage them in a better way. And this is, as we said before, how we can use simple questions or a consistent methodology to save ourselves effort or to make sure that we use our scarce resources in the best way possible. So this management of attitude is also a very good starting point to be a baseline so that we can start to measure the effectiveness of our communication. So if the first set of measures show us the current situation or the fact that certain stakeholders need additional communication work, what we need to do is then plan that communication and, of course, record it and come back after a period of time, maybe 3 weeks, maybe 3 months, depending on the work you're doing, and ask the same questions. And so you'll be able to gauge the effectiveness of your communication if the gap between the current attitude and the target attitude has closed in some way. If the gap is closing, you know that what you're doing is being effective. If nothing's changed, it's also a symbol, if you like, to say, well, this communication or this information exchange we've been doing is not working. We need to try something else. And so one of the additional things that this methodology offers is a way to start to think about how effective the work you're doing in engaging stakeholders actually is, and show it in a graphical way.
Okay, Linda, so you've really went into what I was going to ask you next, and that is about the monitoring of the engagement. We have a communication plan and we can implement that, but of course, it's not just a matter of implementing a plan, it's ensuring that that plan is effective. Correct, Linda?
Yes, one of the things that we all do, whether it's project managers or engineers or almost anyone, is planning's good, and we certainly in our first phase of enthusiasm do good plans. But unless those plans are carried out, the time spent on that enthusiastic planning is wasted. And not only that, nothing is achieved. And so there are a number of ways that you can start to make sure that the plan is implemented. Some simple things is putting planning milestones in a schedule so that they will be reported at team meetings, so that some of the less experienced project team members or team members can start to learn how to communicate or exchange information in a more effective way. And so this is one of the things that anybody can do, any team can do, to report on implementation of different types of communication at the meetings. One of the things we've now included in software that we've developed is a contact management functionality, which just automates that. So if you decide you need to have meetings on a regular basis, instead of putting into the schedule, you will get reminders out of the software tool into your email to say, well, it's time to plan another meeting. Will also enable you to send out reports, which are obviously crucial to communication or information exchange.
Now, Linda, chapter 7 in your book is about effective implementation. And what I really enjoyed reading in this particular chapter was the concept of zero cost of stakeholder engagement. Can you expand a little bit more on that concept?
So anybody who was working in organisations in the 80s will have witnessed how difficult it was to implement quality management in organisations. So quality is now part of everything we do, whether it's projects or organisational activities, almost anything. And it is about consistent processes, and it's based on the work of some very interesting thinkers, one of which had the mantra that said, quality has no cost. And the zero cost of quality really was that the money that an organisation or a group spends on investing in the appropriate training, process development and compliance audits is going to be balanced by the cost that an organisation incurs in rework. So there will be reduction in product defects or software defects. There'll be a reduction in product recalls or any rework that has to be done. And that was the basis of the zero cost of quality. And so when I was trying to think of ways to counter the question that I always have when I talk to organisations about improved stakeholder management, the question always is, well, what's the business case for spending more money on stakeholder management? What's the value to us? And so that was why I started to think in terms of quality, because this is what stakeholder management is about as well. It's about process and practice and compliance and doing things in a consistent way. And the analogy lends itself very nicely. So what we've been trying to do now is start to have thinking amongst the senior management and also other people within organisations of that same way of thinking. The money that you spend in training or extra resources to help people communicate and engage more effectively with their stakeholders will actually be balanced by things like increase in corporate reputation, increase in customer satisfaction, return business, and also reduction of rework, because particularly in IT projects, for example, there's a lot of cost of the rework of dealing with defects or requirements that haven't been properly gathered and supported. And so that's really the basis for us of the zero cost of stakeholder engagement, that whatever you put in is going to be balanced and probably exceeded by the benefits in understanding who your stakeholders are and engaging them effectively and engaging them all, not just focusing on specific groups.
Linda, in the book, you write about defining organizational readiness. And in that particular chapter, you talk about the stakeholder relationship management maturity. Now, that reminds me of CMMI levels of maturity, different project and program management levels of maturity. Talk us through this concept of maturity in relation to stakeholder management.
I unashamedly borrowed the concept of CMMI in doing this because once again, we were struggling with successful implementations. People would very enthusiastically decide to take on the whole of stakeholder engagement, starting from a base of nobody really did very much in the organisation at all. And one of the things that we decided was a useful thing to do for organisations is allow them to understand where they are from the point of view of stakeholder engagement in the same way that CMMI has done for software engineering or OPM3 has done to a lesser extent for project, program and portfolio. And I used the same ratings as CMMI. So, for example, level 1 is there's some stakeholder engagement activity in the organisation, but it's not consistent and it's part of one person's enthusiasm. If that person leaves, the whole concept goes. And we're able to, at each level, make suggestions or give guidelines about what they should be implementing from the point of view of improved stakeholder engagement. So that if you're not very experienced within your organisation on using processes and practices in a consistent way to engage stakeholders, there's no point in implementing $1 million system or training everybody because it's just not going to work. And that what that will mean is that people will say the next time, oh, we tried that, it didn't work, so there's no point in doing it again. Whereas by understanding the level the organisation is at and providing them with guidelines that match that level, they're going to see some quick improvements. It's going to be something that's sustainable, and it's also not going to waste money, which is obviously very important within organisations these days. So from the point of view of using a maturity model and helping organisations define stages, we're making sure that whatever implementations we do of stakeholder engagement practices is sustainable, is not going to just be moved in the next organisation restructure or when that particular champion goes.
Now, Linda, we've talked from the point of view of why stakeholders are important and who should be our stakeholders to focus on and a process, etc. Now, this all seems very well, but what are the consequences of not managing our stakeholders effectively?
Well, in the book, Stakeholder Relationship Management in the revised edition, I put in a case study about BP's disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. And I found that a fascinating case study of how leadership, when focused on single aspects like shareholder value or increasing profits to the detriment of everything else, causes such disaster. And so just thinking in terms of BP and what happened in the Gulf of Mexico with an enormous oil spill that took millions of dollars to clean up. 12 people died when the oil rig exploded. People lost their livelihood all around that area. BP became liable for, I think, it's upwards of $6 billion now. They lost their corporate reputation. People died not just in the Gulf of Mexico disaster, but in other ones previously, because in the process of trying to cut costs, they were doing things like putting the safety of their own people at risk. So all of these things came from focusing on one thing, as in trying to increase profitability, to increase the share value, and forgetting about all of the other stakeholders. And so this is a great example. You can sort of take all sorts of different lessons from this. Importance of focusing on more than one type of stakeholder, of recognising that if you neglect important aspects like safety, you do that at your peril. People will die. Other people will lose livelihoods. Your reputation will go. And so all of those things, in my view, of course, other people will have different takes or different lenses of viewing the BP disaster, but my lens is always about stakeholders and relationships. And so for me, it's an ideal example of what happens when stakeholder engagement or stakeholder relationship management is ignored or not processed properly, and the focus is just on the mantra of shareholder value and increased profits.
Now, Linda, I'm sure many of our listeners are thinking, well, yes, that's a great example, Linda, that oil spill disaster, but my project, my program, it's not on that scale. So, if we're looking at the other end of the scale, Linda, again, talk us through some of the consequences of inadequate stakeholder management of those smaller initiatives.
So everyday aspects or smaller initiatives, by neglecting a particular stakeholder because they don't seem important enough, you will put yourself in danger of having that quiet stakeholder or ignored stakeholder refuse to cooperate. Something as simple as that. Everybody needs to feel that they're important, and stakeholder engagement processes and communication will do this. So first of all, by just understanding who's going to be useful for the success of the work you're doing, that's the starting point. But then making sure that everybody that you need to make your work successful get something back, which is obviously the what's in it for me, the mutuality aspect of any relationship. We don't go into relationships for one-sided reasons. We always take something, but we give something back. And it's the same with stakeholder relationships as well. Often we only consider people or our stakeholders in terms of what they can do for us. But if we remember that they have expectations and needs as well, and with our communication and our other actions, we actually try to deliver to them what their needs or expectations are, everybody's going to win. So once again, this is one of the key aspects of stakeholder engagement, not only knowing who they are, but what they expect to receive or what they need back. And this is often about communication. Often it's about information. So if somebody doesn't get the information they need, they may stop supporting the work, or they may support something else, or they may not cooperate. We come back to what I said initially. It's people that are key to the success of everything you do. And if we forget that, even in technology projects, if we forget that, we do so at our peril.
Linda, I'd like to finish our interview on a positive note. Now, we've talked about some of the consequences of inadequate stakeholder management, but what are the benefits of good stakeholder relationship management?
Everybody's happy. Now, that seems like a flip comment, but one of the areas that I do a lot of work in these days is in leadership and management of teams. And team members, the team itself and team members, are actually important stakeholders of any activity. And if their needs are understood and they are motivated, they will be happy. And actually that will mean that morale is high, motivation is high, output is high, and we're more likely to be successful. If things go wrong, a happy team, a well-managed and motivated team is going to be able to step in and work their way through those issues. So that's one of the most positive aspects of team leadership or team management from the point of stakeholder engagement. But the same thing will apply if your senior stakeholders feel that they are their relationships between themselves and the project are working well. When things go wrong, they will be happy to help you out, because I will have spent the time in the meantime, before there was any sense of urgency, I would have built that relationship. And so when things do go wrong, I don't need to start telling them who I am and what I'm doing. They know about it, they're willing to help. And so for all of those reasons, it's worth the extra time and effort to build those important relationships.
Linda, it's been a great insight speaking with you today about the book, and I can thoroughly recommend that to anyone who's listening. Stakeholder Relationship Management. I've actually got the revised edition. Any more books in the pipeline, Linda?
Yes, I'm working on one now that's called Making Projects Work, and it's focusing on really just stakeholder and communication effectiveness. And the basis of that was actually the course I teach in Colombia, which is called Managing Project Teams. And I found that while there's a lot of books on leadership and team management, there wasn't anything that really focused on how to make communication effective, how to be an effective leader, how to lead effective teams. And so this is my book. So I hope to have it finished by the end of July and in print and on the bookshelves before the end of the year.
And for those who are listening who eagerly want to go and find out more about your approach to stakeholder management, Linda, where can they find that?
Well, I have a website, www.stakeholdermapping.com. So that's probably the best place to start. A lot of my papers are there. My thesis is there. How the software works. Everything that you would need to know about stakeholders is there. It's the one-stop place.
Linda, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today and reading your book. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
You have just listened to another business transformation podcast from Consult Llewellyn. To discover more on how companies can achieve successful business transformation, visit www.consult-llewellyn.com for free resources. And be sure to subscribe to Business Transformation Monthly.